Hello, everybody. Hello, and welcome back to Take a Break with History, coming to you live from Abraham Lincoln Bookshop in Chicago. If it is on our shelves, it is history. My name is Bjorn Skaptason, and I am happy to be with you today. And we have a very special episode of Take a Break with History today. If some of you are fans of our live stream book signing and book discussion program, A House Divided, you will recognize John White, who was with us just one day ago, talking about several of his new books. And one of them is a very important, very exciting book. And we are going to discuss that one today, as well as some other topics having to do with Women's History Month. Remember, it is March, and every year in March is Women's History Month. And one of the reasons that Women's History Month is in March, one of the reasons we, what am I going to say, recognize it in March is because around the world, March 8th is International Women's History Day, or International Day of the Woman, I think is how we celebrate that. So March has traditionally been a time when we want to stop and take a breath and look around at how women have affected the history of the world and the history of the nation, and how important their stories are, and how important it is for us to tell the stories of women in history. And part of that, as I've said many times, is not just how some women make history, it's that women write history. And it is very important to recognize the women that make history, and it's very important to recognize the women that write history. And so we have a couple of very special guests today who helped John White write his new book, My Day with Abe Lincoln. And so I want everybody to welcome Charlotte and Clara White to Take a Break with History. Hello, Charlotte. Hello, Clara.
Hello.
Thank you very much for coming on the program today. It's a real honor to have you here.
We're excited to be here.
Yeah. Now, the first thing I want to do, let me see what I'm doing here. I have a picture of the book you wrote together, and that is My Day with Abe Lincoln. That's what it looks like. I already showed you a picture of it. And you see there that I see Lucy's there, and she has her hat. And here is a picture I have. Clara, is that Lucy's hat you're wearing?
Yes.
So if you wear that hat, do you get to go back in time and meet with Abraham Lincoln?
Have you tried it? No.
No, but you got to wear it that day. Yeah, that was a picture with the Gilder Lehrman Lincoln Prize that was awarded to John White for writing, I had a copy of it right here, for writing A House Built by Slaves. A very good book that you wrote last year. But first, let's talk about today's book. Before we go on and talk about women in history, which is going to be very important, I want to talk about the book that your dad wrote and that you helped him write. And so, John, can you start off, because we don't have the same people watching today we had yesterday. Could you start off by telling us what My Day with Abe Lincoln is and how you decided you wanted to write it?
Sure. So Charlotte is almost 11 and Clara just turned 8 about little over 2 weeks ago. So for a decade now, I've been telling them lots of stories. Lots of times they're about animals, like bunnies like this one and other friends. And at bedtime, we would tell lots of stories. And then I also would read them a lot of history books. And I decided maybe about 4 years ago that I wanted to try my hand at taking that sort of storytelling that we would do, the fun, playful, adventurous storytelling at night, turn it into a kid's book about Lincoln and try to find a way to make Lincoln's story adventurous for kids. And so the idea we came up with was that a little girl in 3rd grade would not want to go to school one day, and she would throw a little bit of a tantrum and dress in a very silly outfit that finished off with a top hat from her brother's magic kit. And when she travels back in time, she meets a young Abe Lincoln. That hat makes her travel back in time. She meets a young Abe Lincoln and spends the day with him and learns all sorts of fun and exciting facts about his life.
So do they go to school with Abe?
They do. She spends the day with Abe, goes to school, meets his friends, meets his sister, learns all about what school was like, how different a school was back then versus what it would be like today. Then after school, she has nowhere else to go, so they invite her back home for dinner, and she gets to meet the family as well.
That's wonderful. It's a wonderful story. Uh, Charlotte, can you tell me something you learned about Abraham Lincoln's school day that's different from when you go to school?
Well, for one thing, it was very small, and our school is ginormous for at least a school.
Mm-hmm.
So
What was it like? How many rooms?
there was one room. They might be lucky to have two where they put their cloaks or when they walk in, but that was probably about it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, the kind of school that Abraham went to at the time, what they used to call it a Blab School, didn't they, John?
Yep.
Now, why did they call it a Blab School?
Can you explain that, Clara?
Yes. So they called it a blab school because you would just do things out loud. Like in a spelling bee, you would just say the word out loud instead of writing it on paper.
And you would
So-
do all your reading out loud, and there were lots of children from all different ages and grades, all in one room doing their lessons out loud. And so it sounded a lot like blab, 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 blab. So they called it a blab school.
Right. Now, what did you learn about what part of school was Abraham Lincoln not very good at? He obviously wasn't the perfect student.
You want to talk about that, Charlotte?
He was not the best at spelling. I think this was a poem he wrote and spelled a lot of words wrong. I think it was the beginning line was Abraham Lincoln is my name, and with this pen I write the same.
I wrote in both
Oh,
haste and speed.
yeah.
Remember the last line?
And left it here for fools to read.
That's right. Very good.
And he spelled haste wrong and
Name.
oh yeah.
Do you remember what letters he left off a name and haste? The E. That's right.
He left off the E. Well, I'll tell you what, this doesn't come from your book, but it's a famous quote from an American president, and it may be right or it may be wrong. You may know, John, but supposedly Andrew Jackson says, "I feel sorry for anybody who can only think of one way to spell a word."
Huh, I've never heard that, but that's you girls should use that the next time you have a spelling test.
Well, so tell me about, I want to know about how you three worked together to tell the story. I know your dad wrote the story down, but how did you work together to tell the story of Lucy meeting with Abraham and his sister Sarah?
You want to talk about that, Clara? Or go ahead, Charlotte.
He's been wanting to write a children's book for a while, actually. Because he always writes book for old people. That's what he says in the book. And it's been really fun to write a book. And we're writing another book about Lucy traveling back in time to meet President Abraham Lincoln. And we decided on a lot of things. Like most of the pictures were decided on by me and my sister. That's something that we did a lot. Yeah.
We met with the artist and the girl. We went chapter by chapter and talked about what pictures we thought should be illustrated, what scenes should be illustrated.
I'm going to meet the artist right there real quick. There's Maddie.
Yep.
Maddie Renault.
And we met with Maddie at the coffee shop on campus at Christopher Newport University. It's called Einstein's. And we came up with a list of all the images we thought we needed in the book. And then Charlotte and Clara and Maddie and I got to sit there one day and just sort of talk about what did we think they should look like. And Maddie actually worked Charlotte and Clara into the book twice. So they have a little message at the beginning. And Maddie found out that Clara loves mice. And so she drew Clara wearing with a shirt with a mouse on it. And Charlotte loves Harry Potter. And so what is it called that you're wearing?
A snitch.
A snitch. So Maddie drew into the picture with Charlotte wearing a snitch necklace.
Wearing a snitch.
Maddie was paid very good attention to detail in the drawings.
So that shows that it's very important when you're working on a project together for everybody to work together and help each other, right?
Yep. We would go out sometimes and spend hours at a restaurant or a coffee shop, and we would just read through the book and talk about line by line. And the girls had very good ideas and suggestions. If there were words they thought maybe weren't the best word, to try to think about how we could make it as accessible for kids as possible.
One of
Right.
the examples is we went to Chick-fil-A for 4 hours.
Yep.
Hmm.
Book.
Yep.
And by the end of that, we were very tired and probably didn't have to have any dinner.
Yep. We had eaten and had a lot of lemonade that day.
If you go to Chick-fil-A for 4 hours, you can probably have like 2 meals, probably.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, you mentioned that there's another book coming out. Now, My Day with Abe Lincoln is going to school with Abe and Sarah. I guess before we go to the other book, I want to know, we've learned a lot about Abraham Lincoln, and we've learned a lot about how he worked at school. What did you learn about Sarah? Tell me a story about Sarah Lincoln that is interesting to you.
What do you think about Sarah? Well, you know what's funny? When Charlotte was 2 years old and her mom was pregnant with Clara, Charlotte, I don't know if you remember this, she wanted us to name Clara Sarah. Since Abe had a sister, Sarah, she wanted to have one too. Sarah isn't as much of a, she in the story, she sort of helps the story move along. And the thing that we learn a lot about her in the book was how much she loved her brother, but then also we learned stories about Abe Lincoln's youth through Sarah telling some of them to Lucy. And so
Okay.
that's one of her biggest roles in the book.
And one of my favorite parts in the book, I know it's a sad part, but Sarah gets very sad when their mother dies, and Abe and Dennis try to cheer her up. And to me, that showed that, it's not, living out in the country could be very sad. Living on that frontier could be very sad.
That's right. And it was very hard. Sarah was about 11 years old when their mom died, and she tried to become the woman of the house. But in the wilderness in Indiana, with no glass on the windows or door in the door frame or wood on the floor, it was more than an 11-year-old. I mean, Charlotte will be 11 in about 2 months. It was more than an 11-year-old could handle. And that's when Thomas then went and remarried and married Sally Bush Johnston.
So yeah, I do want to hear, because we're about halfway through the time that we can spend together today. I'd like to hear a little bit more about the next book. I hear that you're going to get to meet. I hear that we're going to get to meet Willie and Tad. But I guess you girls have already met Willie and Tad and know a little bit about them.
What do you think about Willie and Tad, Clara?
I think that they are very funny, because we should include this in the second book, but they attach a goat to a chair and they ride it around on a very fancy dinner.
That's right. It's the famous story about Tad hitching up a goat to a chair and riding it through the White House in the midst of a reception of some sort. And you can just imagine all the fancily dressed guests just being horrified and shocked by the president's son doing this. And so as we've written book 2, Tad tells this story to Lucy about how he had done it that one day.
Okay. Tad loved animals, didn't he?
He did, just like his dad. Way. Yeah. And Abraham Lincoln never really disciplined his sons. And so they kind of ran wild around the house in the White House.
All right. Well, that's wonderful. Now, there's something that is coming up today for both, soon for you, Charlotte, and for Clara. So I want to ask you about that now before I talk about some things that I want to talk about. And that is, for school, I understand you are going to talk about your favorite women in history. So I'm going to start with Clara. And Clara, can you tell me what you're going to say at school about your favorite woman in history?
Who's your favorite woman?
My favorite woman in history is Clara Barton. She was really kind, and when she was young, her brother, she wasn't even 3 years old, and he put her on a horse. And then when she was 12, the guy that put her on the horse, David, he broke his leg, I think. so she barely went outside, and her shyness grew a lot. And her parents wanted her to open up a one-room schoolhouse for summer school.
And
That's
she
a
became
good story.
well, right?
And then during the Civil War, she decided to be a nurse, so everybody called her the angel of the battlefield.
Mm-hmm. That's
Right.
right. Now we have a picture of Clara. We looked at that together a few minutes ago. There you go, Clara. There's your Clara. Clara Barton, and she's a little older there. And there, I'm going to hold it up. She has signed it. She took a pen and she signed the picture. And you see what she's wearing around her neck there, Clara?
A red cross.
A red cross. Why is she wearing a red cross?
Because she started the American Red Cross.
That's wonderful. You're right about that. Now, Charlotte, who is your favorite woman in history?
My favorite woman in history is Eliza Hamilton
Mm-hmm.
because she started an orphanage for children, not just some children, but a lot. And when her husband, Alexander Hamilton, died, she had to lose her house, and she got money from when her dad died to rebuy the house, and they made it an orphanage. And she worked with another lady to have all the kids that stay there. And then she made a free school, I think it was called the Washington Free School, for kids who who couldn't afford to get into school, or yeah.
And did she have a lot of kids that lived in the orphanage with her?
A lot. She
A
had
lot? Where was it?
people.
Do you remember what city it was in?
Do you remember what city it was in?
New York.
It was in New York. All right. So Clara Barton and Eliza Hamilton, who are both very good choices for favorite women in history. John, do you have a favorite woman in history?
Oh, that's a great question. I would probably say Sojourner Truth.
Ooh,
I
that's a
think
good
her
choice.
story is fascinating, how she was born into slavery in New York, because we often don't think about New York as being a slave state,
Mhm.
but it was when she was born, and she ran away from slavery, and she had actually a son who was sold away from her, but in the 1820s, she was able to fight that in court and win and get her son returned. And then she became such an incredible leader and speaker, and even met Abraham Lincoln in 1864, which is something I've written about and thought a lot about. I think her story is really an extraordinary one.
I certainly agree with that too. And I'm glad you brought up abolition, because there's a couple things I want to talk about here today. And because we're Abraham Lincoln Bookshop, we have artifacts of history, things that actually come from history, like the picture of Clara Barton that people can see. And I want to see something I'm very excited about that does involve abolition and women. We're going to talk about it more. But do you see that newspaper? Although you probably don't see newspapers at all, Clara and
Not
Sharon.
much.
But this is a newspaper called the Liberator, and it was published during slavery times and during the Civil War by a man named William Lloyd Garrison. And its goal was to convince people in America to abolish slavery and to liberate the enslaved people. Now, this is called a masthead, and that's what the top of the newspaper looks like. And every copy of the Liberator looked like this. It was very artistic, and you see, images of slavery on one side and images of free people on the other, people coming out of slavery. And that's what the masthead, that's what that's called, the top of a newspaper, looks like. Now, there are a couple of articles in this Liberator, and it was the last Liberator ever published. It was December of 1865, and the states were about to ratify the 13th Amendment, and then all of the people who had been enslaved would now be freed. And this is one of the most important articles. It's right on the front page, and it's by Mrs. L. Maria Child, by Maria Child, Through the Red Sea to the Wilderness. And I'm not going to read deeply into it, but it's Mrs. Child looks back on all the years that the Liberator was published and how people said bad things about it and how some people in the government tried to stop people from reading it. They tried to suppress it. And she remembers about that, and she thinks about how nice it is that now the slavery is over, even though they're going to stop the publication. Also at the top of the newspaper, Mr. Garrison decided to publish this very interesting letter from President Lincoln. Now, remember at the time, at December of 1865, President Lincoln has already died, and people are trying to remember what he said and what he thought. And on this article, Mr. Garrison prints a letter from President Lincoln to a Union general, a general named General Wadsworth, where in January of 1864, a year before the 13th Amendment, in January of 1864, President Lincoln tells General Wadsworth that he thinks African-American men should be allowed to vote. Not just that slavery should be ended, but that African-American men should be allowed to vote. And in fact, he talks about universal suffrage, which means everybody should have their right to vote protected. And so with that, Mr. Garrison is telling the world, hey, slavery is over, but we still have work to do. We still need to get the vote for African-American men. But now we turn to the third page of the newspaper and we see an article from a woman named Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Charlotte and Clara, do you know who Elizabeth Cady Stanton is? Have you learned about her yet?
They've learned about Susan B. Anthony, and
Okay.
she was one of Susan B. Anthony's close friends and people she worked with.
Yeah. Now, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, in this article in the Liberator, this number of the Liberator says, yes, it's nice that we have eliminated slavery, but it is time for us to get the vote for women. We cannot forget women when we're talking about getting the right to vote. So that, I think, is something very exciting, and I'm going to let people know where they can read more about it in the comments here. John, have you ever worked with copies of the Liberator?
I've never had an original like that. Every year in my classes, when I talk about slavery, I read my classes an editorial from the first issue of the Liberator, which was January 1st, 1831, where Garrison explained why he was starting the newspaper, and it was to fight against slavery. And then I tell them that the newspaper lasted until December 1865, when the 13th Amendment was ratified and you didn't need it anymore. And so it's pretty incredible to see the original copy of the final issue.
Right. But of course, Miss Elizabeth Cady Stanton thinks maybe the Liberator does need to continue so that women can get the vote. Now, I want to look at another book I have, and Charlotte and Clara, this is something that's very close to your house, where you are right now. This is a book called Hampton and Its Students. Do you guys know where Hampton University is?
Do you know where that is? Right down 64.
It's a school that's very close to where you live. And now I have showed the people on this show Hampton and Its Students several times, so I'm not going to talk too much about it, but I want to point out one thing. This was a book written in 1874, and it's a history of Hampton University, written by Mrs. M.F. Armstrong, and she was married to the president of Hampton, and Helen Ludlow. And these were both women who were teachers, professors at Hampton University. So they wrote the book that told the history of Hampton University. Now, they include a picture of what Hampton University looked like back then. See that? Back then, they just had one building. And you can see in the bottom of the picture, the water. So you can see that Hampton University is right by the water, right?
Yeah, it's got a beautiful location right on the Hampton River and near the Chesapeake Bay.
Now, one of the important things they have at Hampton University, one of the things that's very historic, is something called the Emancipation Oak. And that is where the people that were living as refugees on the area that's now the Hampton campus learned that President Abraham Lincoln had issued the Emancipation Proclamation, and that now that they were going to be freed from slavery. And I hear the Emancipation Oak is still there. Have you ever seen it?
Yes.
What's it
What?
like?
It is very large.
Hmm.
Could you fit a class under it?
I really don't know.
You don't know? It's a very large oak tree, and we
Small
have
class, maybe.
a small, I think you could fit about 20 or 30 students.
Mhm.
And it's a beautiful live oak tree, hundreds of years old. And it used to be that you could go and stand under it. Now they have a fence around. I think they were worried about people climbing onto it. But if visitors ever come to Hampton Roads, it is something worth seeing. And it's right off of Route 64, very close to Fort Monroe, where
Very close to Fort Monroe, which is one of the reasons why Hampton University is where it is, because Fort Monroe was where the refugees from slavery came to get protection, and where General Butler declared that they were contraband of war and therefore they didn't have to be slaves anymore. Then came the refugee camps. Then they had to open schools for the refugee camps. And finally, after the war was over, that is where they built Hampton University.
Yep.
Yeah, it's very, very interesting story. I have one more thing I want to share before we sign off. And once again, it's a story of women writing history, an important history book written by a woman who had already written a very important book in history. And Charlotte and Clara, have you heard of Harriet Beecher Stowe and her book, Uncle Tom's Cabin?
Have you heard of that one? Not yet.
It's a very important book. You're going to learn about it in school. But Harriet Beecher Stowe was very famous for writing a book called Uncle Tom's Cabin. Now, this is another book by Harriet Beecher Stowe called Men of Our Times, and it was written after the war. And why I think this book is important, is written in 1868, is that Harriet Beecher Stowe was already famous. Everybody knew who she was because she had written Uncle Tom's Cabin. There's a picture of Harriet Beecher Stowe, an engraving from the front of the book called the frontispiece, an engraving by A.H. Ritchie, who was a famous artist at the time. And why I think the book is important and fun is that since Harriet Beecher Stowe had already written a famous book about slavery and ending slavery, after slavery ended, everybody wanted to know what she thought about people like Abraham Lincoln and Ulysses S. Grant and Edwin Stanton and all of the people, all of the men who were important in winning the war. But people wanted to know what a woman, Harriet Beecher Stowe, thought of those men. And so she wrote a book about Abraham Lincoln and Edwin Stanton and General Grant and a whole bunch of other very important men. So that's why I think that book's important. And like I said before, I think Women's History Month is very important for us to remember the history of women, but also for us to remember the women who write history books. People like you, Charlotte, and you, Clara, who helped your dad write a history book about Abraham Lincoln. So, thank you very much for joining us on the program today. Is there anything else the three of you would like to say about My Day with Abe Lincoln or your upcoming books?
Anything you want people to know about My Day with Abe? No? Well, we are very excited about having that book out. We think it'll get kids interested and excited about learning about Lincoln. And we are very grateful to you for having us on with the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop again.
Oh, thank you very much, John. And thank you, Charlotte. And thank you, Clara, for joining us. And for all of you who've joined us on the live stream here, Take a Break with History, live from Abraham Lincoln Bookshop in Chicago. Thank you for joining us, and we will see you next time.